Hello, my name is Mary Campbell, and I'm ESA's Manager of Membership Governance and Awards. I'll be your host today during this online session. Thank you for joining us for the ESA webinar series. During today's session, we would like to make sure you're getting the most out of your participation in this online course. All attendees will be muted on entry to the call due to the high volume of participants. At this time, I'd like to bring your attention to a tool that may be of use to you during this session. On the right-hand side of your screen, today you'll use the questions box, which will allow you to post questions to this tool during the presentation, and the questions will be filtered to the speaker during our question and answer section. Please type a note in the chat box, and that'll go directly to staff. At this time, I'll turn the session over to Dr. Karen Kelsky.
Thank you very much, Mary. I appreciate being here for a second webinar with ESA. Oops. Hang on. If you heard that. So thank you, Mary, for that, for having me again to ESA. I'm very pleased to be here to do a second webinar. And this week it's on the post-AC transition and looking at how you might think about transitioning away from the tenure track job search to a non-academic job search. Last week we had a session on the academic job search, and the thing is, I'm actually not sure how many of you were at that session. So I imagine a number of you were. I imagine some of you were not. So I'm going to be just repeating just a couple of ideas that will from last week to set up the scenario. So for those of you who were here last week, this will be familiar. And but it's a critical background for understanding what why I give the advice that I do, actually. So first of all, for anyone who wasn't here last week, I just wanted to say a word of self-introduction. I am the founder and president of the Professors In. I was formerly a tenure track and tenured professor in anthropology and East Asian studies. My PhD was from University of Hawaii, and then I was on the tenure track and tenured at University of Oregon and University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And as I mentioned last week, was friends with an entomologist there at UIUC. I was also department head at UIUC for 5 years. And when I left the academy for reasons that I describe in my book, I realized that what I wanted to do was take the years of knowledge that I had, really intense knowledge and passion, honestly, that I had for grad student professionalization, and bring it to a wider audience. And so I started the Professors In 2011, and we have actually worked with over 10,000 clients in the years so far. I now have a staff who do editing with me, and also our purposes today, a wing of post-academic coaches who specialize in helping on this transition. So if you feel like you need help, just get in touch with the email that's at the bottom. And I do, as I mentioned last week, I have a book. And the last part of the book, I think it's section 5, is on the post-academic transition. So please do check out those chapters. They have some really good information in them, more than I can share in 1 hour today. And they have something that I love. I'm going to mention it again today, but they have a list. One of the chapters is a list of 100 skills that virtually every PhD has just by virtue of being a PhD. These are things that you may not be used to thinking about because they're so widely shared amongst the people you associate with. But they really, this list really helps you begin to understand yourself from that non-academic viewpoint, which is such a hard transition to make when you've been in academia for so long. So let's get started. When you go on, when you think about, even when you begin to have the first glimmerings of a contemplation that you might need to go on the non-academic job market, it really feels for most people like you have been cast out into the void. just like Gravity, the movie, which this GIF is taken from. It doesn't have to feel that way, but I completely understand why it does. And I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit today because, you know, well, I'm going to say this again, but there are a lot of resources out there on the non-academic transition. And if you Google PhD non-academic job search, you're going to find a lot of different really valuable resources. The thing that distinguishes my approach is, this slide is out of order. The thing that distinguishes my approach is that I really try to think about less about the logistics, although I do talk about them, and more about the psychological challenges that PhDs confront when they're thinking about leaving behind the academy, and the emotional challenges, because those are, in my opinion, the biggest barrier. Okay, so this should have been earlier, but if you do live tweet, be sure and by the way, you guys did amazing live tweeting last week. I was so delighted. Very, very rare that people are as active on Twitter as a lot of you folks were, so I really appreciated that. If you do live tweet, don't forget to @ me at Professor Zin. I love to see what you're saying, and the picture thing is for live events, not for webinars, most likely, I suppose. Anyway, yeah. So here's where I'm going to start a little bit of repetition from last week, and that is that when you're in the PhD program, whether even when you're first thinking about it, which is, you know, a long time ago for you folks, just first thinking about applying to a PhD program, then you get into it, then you begin to work in it, and then you reach the end of it. That entire arc, the most important thing you can do is think of it as training for a job. Now, in most other realms of the economy, that would be so obvious as not to need stating, but in academia, in graduate school, it is actually a countercultural position. You aren't supposed to consider your PhD as vocational training. You're supposed to view it as some kind of holy calling that is outside the realm of capitalism and things like salaries and retirement plans. And my intervention from day one, and this is even before I started the Professors In, this was my intervention from the minute I started getting obsessed with grad student professionalization, when I was still an assistant professor myself, is to insist that academic work, it is labor, it is subject to the same principles of supply and demand that other realms of the economy are, the labor market are, and that nobody should ever work for free, and that exploitation is the norm because this is thoroughly embedded in capitalism, and they will exploit you unless you really, well, not everyone is exploited all the time, but the system is fundamentally exploitative because of what I'm about to tell you, and you have to protect yourself. And the most important thing you can do in protecting yourself is to have realistic knowledge and not be subject to the false hope and the mythologizing that grad programs do, and that as professional associations do, with regard to just viewing themselves as somehow separate from normal job market logic. So please say no to denial, say no to avoidance and evasion and mythologizing, and say yes to actual job preparation from the earliest possible moment you can, both academic and non-academic, assuming that you do want to be trying for the tenure track job. Please don't neglect the non-academic at any point. The reason that this is so imperative is that the higher ed system has shifted since about 1975 from a scenario in which 75% of university faculty were tenure line or tenured in the 70s to where now 76 to 78% of university faculty aren't contingent. They are hired off the tenure track. That means only 24 to 22% of faculty at every institution across the land is teaching on the tenure track or tenured. That's a catastrophic disintegration of higher ed hiring, and that is the job market you're confronting. This is not just University of Phoenix, not just community colleges. Whatever denial is operating in your mind right now, I'm going to confront it. No, this is all the major institutions. This is the Ohio State, Berkeley, University of Oregon, Yale, and Princeton, and the Ivy Leagues, and all of them. This is across the board. There is a shift to contingent labor. This is because of defunding and the corporatization of the university system. Now, there are some decent contingent contracts that are multi-year and bring benefits and so on. So they're not all awful. But if you are hired on an adjunct basis, course by course, paid $2,000–3,000 per course without anything else, amongst adjuncts, 25% of adjuncts live below the U.S. poverty line and qualify for food stamps and welfare. So this is a very drastic scenario that you need to confront, whether your advisors do or not, whether your PI does or not. They don't know. They don't have to know. You have to know. So language like this is my calling, this is my vocation, I have to do this no matter what, that has to go by the wayside. Calculate the ROI, which is return on investment. And this is anathema, right? This horrible corporatized language, I get it, but this is what I want you to do. So the fact is, your chances of getting a job are between 10 and 35%. You're getting a tenure track job, depending on the field. Wait a minute, that's wrong. It's between 4 and 35%, because biology, I believe, is a field that did some analysis of this and found out that biology PhDs have a 4% chance of getting a tenure track job. And of course, then the rates of getting tenure are lower than that, but that's not what I'm worried about. I'm not worried about what people do so much on the tenure track. I'm worried about the damage, financial, psychological, emotional, physical health damage that happens in this quixotic effort to get a tenure track job and to believe that you must get that when the entire, almost the entire hiring economy is collapsing or has collapsed. It's quite consistent. This is not new. This has been going on, like I said, since the 70s, and the data is perfectly clear and absolutely transparent. This has not been hidden. This is not secret. It's just that nobody wants to talk about it because it's uncomfortable, and because talking about it would absolutely destroy the working premise of PhD training and the organization of graduate departments. And so the more prestigious the department, the less likely they are to talk about this, because those faculty are dependent on bringing in grad students for their own prestige. And in lower ranking departments, where the budget is more of an issue, they're dependent on PhD students to do the teaching that they don't want to pay others to do. So now I wanted to really address this right up front, because this came up in the Q&A last time, and well, not really coincidentally, but because of that, I had a guest blog post that was in my queue, and I decided to move it up and post it last week. And the Q&A, guest blog post was a Q&A with Karen Kaplan, who is the senior careers editor for Nature. And this is part of what she said. Think twice about doing a postdoc if you're in STEM. Industry does not look kindly on postdocs because it signals to them that the candidate isn't serious about working in industry. So I'm prefacing what I'm about to say with the question that I know you all have, which is, what about the postdoc? So this is what Karen Kaplan, probably one of the greatest experts in the STEM job market that there is in the United States, this is what she had to say. She also had to say, and as you read on, people routinely do 2 or even 3 in the hopes of landing an academic post, and by the time they're done, they're in their 40s, have accrued no retirement funds, no social security quarters, no employer match contributions, they may not have health insurance, they're working in excess of 80 hours a week. Then, if they decide to switch gears and look for that non-academic position, they have no experience except in academia, so they appear to be less qualified to compete against scientists who have been working outside the university. So please keep that in mind. I know that people tend to get a little bit salty when I talk about postdocs and this reality of limiting them. And so I wanted you to know that that's what Karen Kaplan had to say. And that sets me up for the other major question I'm always asked at every time I do this, whether webinar or in person: how long should I try? Now, I cannot answer that question for you because some of you may be very young, you may have no dependents, you may have no debt, unusual, but it does still exist, and you are willing and in fact kind of excited about the idea of living a year here, living a year there, living 2 years here, moving around for these temporary positions while you're looking for the tenure track. Maybe you have a corporate attorney spouse who's willing to support you during long years of precarity and financial insecurity, and it's not going to impact you. Then you don't really have the same ticking clock necessarily as someone who has 2 children, one of whom has a health issue, who absolutely needs to have health insurance. So you're going to make a different decision. So I can't tell you what's true for everybody. I will tell you, like I did last week, that you don't overcorrect because you came to a talk like mine. And sometimes I hear from people who say, well, I tried for 1 year and I didn't get a tenure track job, so that's it. I'm saying goodbye to academia. 1 year is probably premature unless you have circumstances that require that kind of quick reaction, but it's probably a bit premature. It does take most people 3, sometimes 4 years to get that tenure track job. So as long as you're not harming your credit rating, harming your physical and mental health, and so on, you can take some time to try. And then, yeah, you need to pivot. Please don't martyr yourself. What I don't want is, the principle here is, please say no to the martyrdom on the altar of this mythology of this holy academic calling that your advisors and professors and PIs might be, inculcating in your world. So let's get into the nitty-gritty now. It's really hard to imagine transitioning. Now, I know I'm talking to entomologists today, and it may be somewhat less hard for you being in a STEM field as you are than for some folks in the humanities who are in like classics or French literature. But I know that even for STEM folks, for many, it's quite difficult. And this is because academia really is a cult-like environment. It's a fairly benevolent cult, or at least it used to be. I think it's less and less benevolent as time goes by, but it's extremely rigid. It's extremely insular. The longer you spend in it, the less you have access to anybody outside of it. You don't have friends who are outside of it. You're not engaging in conversations outside of it in most cases. Your time is spent, if that's 80 hours a week in the lab, which is, I know, very common, then you're completely surrounded by people who are exactly like you. And so it's a way of life. It's an identity. It takes, a decade to, of the grad training and so on that fully molds you into its image. And so when you imagine leaving it, it isn't just, oh, I'm just going to go from one job to another. It's leaving an identity. And it's leaving a way of life. It's leaving a way of thinking about yourself. It's leaving a way of organizing your year, because of course we're on the academic year. Our year starts in the fall, so it's kind of weird vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And you may really be cutting roots with your community and people who are very close to you. So if you get a knot in your stomach when you think about it, well, I just want to tell you that's totally normal. That's more normal than not. And don't be afraid of that. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means that you are really, truly an academic, and it is really hard to make this transition, but you can do it. So I love this quote from Inside Higher Ed, James Van Wyck, who says in a 2016 article about this transition, the best thing you can do is to learn to think like an entrepreneur. And here's the thing, though. You already are an entrepreneur. And this is what I love about this quote, is that you are tremendously entrepreneurial. You already figured out, hey, there's a thing called grad school and I want to go to it. there's a field I want to enter and make a difference. I've identified a problem out in the world that needs solving. I've figured out how to solve it. Well, not solve it exactly, but, you know, analyze it, interpret it from multiple perspectives. And all of those things are tremendously entrepreneurial. You have a prodigious work ethic that you finished your PhD just like an entrepreneur, finished your dissertation, maybe doing a postdoc. And so all of these things are actually prepping you for what the next stage of life. We tend to think of grad students and postdocs as apprentices, where you're always you're in this subordinate position being led by others, but you actually can completely transform that thinking. I'm not an apprentice, I'm an entrepreneur, and I can dictate what I'm going to do moving forward. Now, we are absolutely hampered in this transition by our absolutely impoverished language that we have for this, because all of our words look like this: post-ac, alt-ac, non-ac, alt-ac. These are all the words, and they're terrible words. Why are they terrible? Because they modify ac. If you're only modifying ac, that means that ac, academic, remains the unspoken norm, the normative the normative model, and you're just modifying that. But if only between 4 and 35%, sorry, my stats are inconsistent, of PhDs are getting a tenure track job, then it's not the tenure track that's the normative, that's the exception. The tenure track job direction is the exception, and going in other directions is the norm. We don't have language for that yet, and we do absolutely need it. But here's what this language can do for you. It can, if you're thinking of if you're using words like post-ac, alt-ac, non-ac, well, then it really identifies a temporary state. It's a prefix. So instead of thinking of it as a non-normative identity, think of it as a temporary transitional state as you move into another kind of work. And as you do that, it's quite important that you define the work you want to do in a positive rather than a negative sense. And I don't mean like, yay, I'm so excited. I don't mean that kind of positive. I mean, you don't be very alert to negatives that enter your sentence structure. So I don't want to work in the academy. I can't find a tenure track job. I have to look for a job that isn't academic. Those all have negatives in them. Rather, I want a job in working in museums. I want a job working in a federal lab. Those are positives. Very important in helping you to launch this different entrepreneurial thinking as you move forward. Here are the problems, though. We have, as PhDs, we have problems. We have implicit structural challenges. We think that we have no skills, except academic ones for the most part. We have no idea what's possible out in the world, and we're steeped in academia because of that 80 hours a week in the lab thing and the intensity of graduate training. So I want you to really look at this list and think about how you can grasp the skills that you actually do have. And by the way, that's where that chapter in my book comes in, that's why I mentioned it. Learn what is possible, and I'm going to give you some directions for learning that. And being steeped in academia, thinking about how you can begin to dip your toe in the water of non-academic communities and circles and information and job markets. Okay, let's investigate these a little bit more. Why do academics feel that we have no skills? This is a slide that I have borrowed with permission from Dr. Margie Horton Thomas. She goes by Thomas now, who is one of my post-academic coaches and founded the business called Scholarship, which is a academic editing and coaching business. She does some wonderful work, and actually she's the one who generated the list of 100 skills that I had mentioned before. She's really terrific at this, at helping people through this transition. And so this is one of her slides from one of her talks, and I love it because it really breaks it down. we are so identified in the PhD by our narrow knowledge, by our very, very narrow expertise, that we begin to think our value resides in that narrow expertise. We completely forget all of the massive sum of skills that we had to master bit by bit, piece by piece, to get to that small thing. But actually, all of those skills have value. Our skills are obscured by CV categories. We live and die by the CV in academia, and that says education, professional appointments, publications, conferences, grants, teaching. And so we get so used to thinking about those as our skill categories, we forget all the others that we have. Like I said, you spend all your time with people who have similar skills, which means you get no credit, you get no bragging rights for 90% of the skills that you have. For example, I'm a Japan anthropologist, I'm a Japan scholar. I mastered Japanese writing and speaking in the course of my studies. Could I ever go to the Association for Asian Studies conference and preface my conference paper by saying, well, so I just want you all to know that I am fluent in spoken and written Japanese. Of course not. That would be preposterous. I would be laughed out of the conference hall. It's totally inappropriate. You can't do that. The assumption is that everyone who's a Japan scholar is fluent in spoken and written Japanese. But the fact is once you step outside that conference hall and step outside the university, that skill, spoken and written Japanese, or all of the ones that you guys have, are extraordinarily rare and quite valuable. Our feedback in academia, this is one of the qualities of our elements of our cult, is that it's focused on critique. That's what you do. You enter academia, you're going to be the subject of critique, and you're going to be the giver of critique. That's what you're trained in. You forget the damage. You might not be aware of the damage that has on your sense of confidence and ability to do anything at all, but particularly to do things outside the academy. You're so used to thinking about your failures and your weaknesses. And then we're surrounded by know-it-alls who are, it's not, academia is not necessarily a terribly supportive environment. So it's not like people are your cheerleaders saying, yay, you, as I've been out of the academy now for 15 years, and I have little by little, bit by bit, created a whole new circle of friends. I still have my academic friends, but I have all these other friends. And I still can't quite get used to the fact that this other circle of friends, if you say, I'm going to do something, the first thing they say is, fantastic, you're going to be great at that. It still wigs me out every time. It's so unnatural because I'm still so much like that person who leads with critique. Well, have you thought about? Well, I'm not sure. Anyway, so here are some places you can go. Obviously, you can go to my website. I have 8 years, no, a little bit less than that, about 6 years of guest blogging by brilliant coaches on their post-academic transition and their advice for post-academic transition based on the work that they have done with clients. So go onto my blog. I know it's not on this list. Why is it not on this list? Anyway, go onto my blog and you'll find absolutely fantastic stuff, plus some webinar recordings that are in the post-academic transition. Now on this list, there is a classic book. So what are you going to do with that? It's in its second printing, I think, second edition, I mean, and all very valuable. Imagine PhD is a free, as far as I know, interactive tool, online tool that is created by the Consortium of Graduate Colleges, and which is a national consortium, and walks you through interactively by answering certain questions. It leads you to an understanding of your strengths and capacities for other non-academic work. The Beyond the Professoriate Conference is a terrific resource. I think it happens once a year, but they have content and different speakers and so on all year long. So check them out. You can find them on Twitter at Beyond Prof. You know, the whole entire blogosphere is filled with people who have written volumes and volumes and volumes about their post-academic transition, because people are really emotional about it, and they have very strong feelings, and they want to share those. So they share their feelings, they share their experiences. There are really good university career websites that are not paywalled. Some of them are paywalled, but I would urge you to try University of Washington, the UC system. Columbia has been very good. And then there's a corporate website and book called Clifton Strengths Finder that you'll find alienating, because it's super corporate. But it's good, though. I mean, if you can get through the language the corporate speak, it's actually quite good at helping you identify what your strengths are. So let's talk more about how you approach this. It is real. You might remember that I said, please frame your goals in the positive, not the negative. And that's because your intentionality is important. And I know I sound like Oprah here, or Dr. Phil, but it's true. It's important that you set your sight on an outcome, but you don't have to be rigid about that outcome. You don't have to have it solved. And this is where the non-academic job search differs drastically, 180 degrees, from the PhD and tenure track job search, because those are completely linear, totally predictable, and ordered. If you do this, you pass your comprehensive exams, you're advanced to this. You write your dissertation proposal, you defend it, you're passed to this. You write your dissertation, you do the research, you do your research, you write up the dissertation, and then you defend it, you're passed to this. Then you get a postdoc, you pass to that, then you get a tenure track job. Totally linear, totally predictable. This is the exact opposite of that. You have no idea how this is going to turn out. You don't, and I know that's scary. But it's okay to take a step and then evaluate. Nothing is the final story. Nothing is the final answer here. Your first post-academic job doesn't have to be your final post-academic job. And all of the different experiments you make in this realm are just opening further doors. This is very hard for you, but that intentionality. Okay, I'll try this, and then okay, that makes me, how is this? And then be alert to doors that open. Now, as you create your intention, you have to know yours will be different from somebody else's. You have priorities. Now, this one was written by Katie Rose Guest-Prial, who is a very prolific post-academic writer. And if you look up her name, which is very long, but if you look it up, you'll see she's written quite on in Chronicle Vitae. And this was hers. Get paid for your work. And in academia, you can't take that for granted. So get paid fairly, I would say. I would add get paid fair. In other words, you're not going to go, take a job in Alabama when you're from New England just to have the job. Stop applying to academic jobs, meaning don't get sucked back in when you make the transition that this time it's going to be different. Remember that there is a community. There is a community out there of people who have walked this path, and you don't have to do it alone. And then this is back with yet another temporary gig. Remember, they're never going to let you in the club. Now, to me, that rings a bit common in the post-academic blogosphere and probably in you. And there's no shame in that. This is a situation where PhDs are brought into a scenario where you're trained, you're told implicitly or explicitly that a thing is available to you, and then you believe that and you act on it, and then at the end they're like available, and you are bitter, and people are bitter. So if you find yourself a place to be, it will stop you from creating the positive intention. Be bitter for a little bit. Know it as a temporary stage, here are the things that you can do from any point. This is what you can do to look for the non-academic job. First of all, you need mentors. They are academics. So you're going to want to be really alert. Now, when I say mentor, I don't mean the academic mentors can be so intense. A mentor might be somebody on a flight, you know, and you're together for 2 hours, and you happen to kind of feel that is somewhat adjacent to one that you might be interested in, and you have a conversation. That's a mentor. Now you might get their card, you might follow up, or you might not. Well, I would advise you probably, if it was appropriate, to follow up, because one of the things you're going to want to do is create a new circle. But in any case, mentors can come in all shapes and sizes. You might have a kid who you have to get a babysitter for, and the babysitter comes, and then the babysitter's mother comes to pick the babysitter up at the end, and you come to the door and you end up chatting a little bit, and it turns out that mother is the CFO of a local company that does quite a bit of hiring in biology and STEM fields, and suddenly you are in a conversation with someone who, just because it was the babysitter's mom, is suddenly someone who can share some valuable info. That's what I mean by mentors, okay? Not just these really totally intense pedestal people on the pedestal. You might have to work for free a little bit, and that's not a sustainable long-term plan, but you do have to build up a resume. So internships, volunteer opportunities, please don't turn up your nose at those while you are just getting your feet wet. Within very severe limits, you can do a little bit of that kind of work. Informational interviews are a well-worn, well-known method out in the corporate world and NGO world for learning about jobs. And what that means is that you contact someone in your circle. They don't have to be, they could be a friend of a friend, and you get you lay the groundwork to be able to say, hey, may I conduct an informational interview with you? If they say yes, then you get a 30-minute slot typically, and you go to their office and you say, so I'm interested in work in this general area, and what I'd like to do is, and please don't use the phrase pick your brain, because I hate that phrase and it's gross and it's overused, but that's sort of the idea here, is I have some specific questions. When you hire, what are you looking for? The people who work here, what kinds of tasks do they have to do? What skills would you say are most important for getting hired in an industry like this? And so you're not looking for a specific job, you're not pitching yourself for a job, you're literally getting information. There's no limit to the number of informational interviews you can do. Now, you might get some additional training. You might need that, some certifications, for example, or other things. Please, I beg of you, don't get another graduate degree. But yeah, there's lots of stuff out there, your Chamber of Commerce, your local library, online courses, YouTube, where you can get more training to put on your resume and just to make you feel confident. And then ask what real life questions in the world your experience and skills speak to. And that's not just the entomology skills that you have or the biology skills, but you may actually have done yoga the entire time you were in grad school. And it turns out that you're an incredibly accomplished yoga teacher or yoga practitioner. That's one of your skills. Please don't forget it. You might be a knitter. Knitting is one of your skills. Please don't forget it. These things matter. Don't write them out of your story. Okay. So now I want to fill in a little bit of that other challenge, the second challenge. You don't know what's out there. You don't need me to tell you what jobs are out there beyond just some generics, because you have research skills. And if you were here last week, you remember I said that's in the Q&A. You are brilliant at research. Use your research skills to the job in the job search. If there's one thing you guys all know how to do here today, you have PhDs, is research, collate information, cross-reference, keep good records, and analyze. So you can do this. So Obviously, people with PhDs work in higher ed administration very frequently. That's the classic alt-ac route, where you'd be in an advising position or a director of the Center for Asian Studies. That's me, of course, maybe not you. People with PhDs work in consulting. You have a lot, you probably, many of you here today, probably have skills particularly related to, and things perhaps related to the environment, that you might be able to hang out a shingle as a consultant on wetlands or other things like that. PhDs often work in nonprofits, and you can find jobs. Go to the website start@idealist.org, really good website, lists nonprofit jobs. Now, financial services, another place that many STEM, not many STEM, but some STEM people end up in because of your facility with numbers. People often make the transition to K through 12 teaching and private high school teaching, and you do need a credential for that, but it's an obvious transition. Not always a great transition, because K through 12 teaching is in terrible financial shape as well, but still. Academic publishing and trade publishing, because of our work in editing and close reading and so on. Publishing is an obvious area. You could go into a cultural, historical, or for STEM folks, federal government, federal labs are a place that you often look for work, and also industry research. I say professional, but what I mean is industry here. And then there's international development and NGOs. And last but not least, entrepreneurship and freelancing, where you're not getting a job listed by someone else, you're creating your own job, which is what I did. And I really want to urge you to do that. As you begin to think about these, you may or may not decide to tell your advisor. You don't have to tell him or her. If they're going to be supportive, sure, tell them. Or by advisor, I also mean PI. But they're not in charge of you. They don't know, they can't really help, and they may really be dangerous and undermining. And there may be, if you're in a situation where there's retaliation, and that's not unknown, then like they're going to snatch your funding away because you revealed that you're looking for post-academic jobs, then don't tell them. Feel free to not tell them. And you don't necessarily need a letter from them, because their letter may or really may not be all that helpful to you, depending on what types of non-academic jobs you're looking for. And remember, if your advisor is helpful, your department is supportive, then mobilize them. And the best thing they can do, get your PhDs, the PhDs from your department who are doing non-academic work, get them in, host them for a visit where they talk to you, give a talk, explain what they're doing, how they got the job, and coach you and your fellow PhDs. Your disciplinary association also often has really valuable information on this that your department may not have. And again, remember the point I made before, I'm making it a second time. This is not a linear and unitary track. It is circular, it is improvisational. You will need many, many mentors, not just that one that you've had so far. Okay, now I mentioned to you that we're looking for the bottom line, the first step in this reinvention is that you grasp how many skills you really have. This is hard because, for all the reasons I mentioned before, but also because we're so accustomed to thinking of ourselves in an identity. I'm a philosopher, I'm a scientist, I'm an academic, I'm a professor, all of these things. I'm a specialist in medieval Italian literature. Those are nouns that don't work anywhere outside of a university system. So you have to disaggregate the noun into its component skills. In other words, disaggregate a singular identity into its multiple component skills. Here is a short list. This isn't the list that I mentioned. This is a shorter list by Dr. Chris Humphreys, who leads Jobs on Toast, which is a business that's based in the UK for people making the post-academic transition. Really good website. And so he makes the point that you all have project skills, communication skills, knowledge and information skills, and firm basis in entrepreneurship. Why? Well, look at all the things you know how to do. You know how to manage a budget. You know how to work in a team. You can solve problems. You can organize meetings and events. We can all organize meetings and events. We just never think about that as a separate skill. You could obviously write public speaking because you go to conferences, publicity and PR. That may be some of you more than others. Stakeholder management, that's corporate language, but guess what that is? That's managing your advisor and your committee members and anyone else who is invested in your project. That's stakeholder management. You're probably pretty good with social media. You know how to do research. You know how to do teaching and training. Very valuable skills. You can write reports. And then, like I said before when I started, the entrepreneurship is huge. You are much more of an entrepreneur than you have ever considered yourself to be. So I want to remind you, like I said before, when I said don't forget your yoga and your knitting, that there are other skills that you have that you gained perhaps before grad school or that you nurtured during grad school that were not the academic ones. So don't forget those. In addition, make sure that you attend to these, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it, the soft skills. So just and did the research and wrote them up and published them, like that's classic academia. The budget of that grant. You communicated with stakeholders about the lab. You communicated with your PI. You communicated at a conference. Again, multiple state undergraduate research assistant in the lab. So don't forget all the summative things that we do as academics. And teaching is a thing of great value that others don't have, not just classroom at a university, but all sorts of training, all campus that have this interface of training others to do up those skills and make sure this is another rubric for thinking about them. Your languages, public speaking, writing. Some of them will be knowledge, though, rather than skills per se. In other words, you're an expert graphical area, geographical expertise, for example, that's knowledge. And then achievement. You wrote a book, you wrote 10 articles, you program, those are achievements. So delineate all of them so that you stop taking them for granted. Research is quantification. They love quantification. And so if you were to work with me on that, I usually tell people to de-quantify because academics all get that much credit for reading X number of pages per day, or reading X number of pages per hour, or typing X number of students. That's not stuff we get a ton of credit for. But when you move into the non-academic world, these numbers do matter quite a bit. They're very helpful. So quantify how much money did you raise? Not just, oh, I raised some money. I raised $33,000 to support a sim about blah, blah, entomology. Be specific, quantify. And again, remember to do this for your hobbies as well. How many hours of yoga did you do? How many, did you do? How many teacher trainings did you do, if you happen to do any of that, or retreats, and so on? You may need to reinterpret flaws, and I'm going to return to this again because the PhDs, it's kind of a chicken or egg thing, but we don't have a great reputation necessarily in the non-academic corporate or NGO or industry world for a number, and I'm going to say more about this later, But the point is that you want to make sure that you aren't feeding stereotypes, bad stereotypes of PhDs. So many of us are incredibly resistant to rigid external structure. A lot of us have authority issues. You want to make sure that you're always using language that frames what you do in the best possible light. Again, perhaps using language like I'm highly self-motivated, I'm very resourceful, as ways to make sense of your record. Let me check my time here. Okay, I'm going to move very quickly through this part because this is information you can get in many, many places, not just from me. How do you do a cover letter and a resume? So the resume will be tailored to the keywords used in the job description, and the cover letter will echo that in prose, usually just one page. So when you think of it, and again, I'm drawing from Maggie Gover, who is another of my post-academic coaches. She is currently an assistant dean of diversity at UCLA and still also does coaching on the side. She's quite marvelous. The resume is a marketing document, and the amazing thing about a resume compared to a CV is, again, it is tailored. It is moved and shifted and massaged for every new job. A CV is not. A CV just sits and is what it is. And it has to address the specific employer needs. So you are going to highlight skills that they specifically called for. It isn't necessarily chronological, although it can be, but there are different kinds of resumes. There's a chronological resume. There's also a skills-based resume, or there's also a combo. And so you will choose amongst those options based on what seems best for the job. And here's why you would do a skills-based resume, is because possibly you were really an expert in something before you started graduate school. That was 10 years ago. If you give a straight chronology, it's gonna that expertise is gonna get so buried down at the bottom that the employer won't see it. But if you do a skills-based resume, then you can bring the skills you gained right up front so that it's immediately visible. Now, I want you to, as always, as I always say, and if you work with me, you'll know this, be specific and use action words. So don't just use passive, was responsible for filing documents. Use, say, I filed and maintained confidential student records. Be specific about money, like I said before, not just I raised funds, but I raised $11,050 for the annual blah, blah benefit, a 15% increase from previous years. Quantify, quantify, quantify. The resume should be 2 pages, and education does go at the end. Shocking for academics, but it does. You know what? Don't worry about what I'm saying about formatting, because the internet is literally filled with resume models that you can draw from, and you can find the model and the advice about skills versus chronological and so on in many other places. And in fact, where I'd like to urge you to look to begin your search is Catherine Hansen, quintessentialcareers.com. I have no affiliation with her. I just really like the information that I saw on her website. She has a line, one of her blog posts is about the objective, and that has gone out of style, but you can still use a focal line if you want to. I'm committed to improving company profits. I mean, this is difficult for us, I think, as academics, language to use, but this is an example, so deal with it. Just, you know, like, okay, this is one thing that people do. You don't have to do it. By contributing bilingual skills and knowledge, blah, 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 to the legal department of a firm that's doing business in Latin America. So that's really summarizes. And that objective would change with each and every job that you applied for, slightly, perhaps. You do use bullet points, which I tell people not to use in academic CVs. And you want to spell out responsibilities, because again, the non-academic world is not as, monolithic as the academic world is. So like when you say you teach a university class, well, everybody knows what that means. We all know you wrote a syllabus. We all know you selected readings. We all know you lectured. That doesn't need explaining. But in a non-academic job search, yeah, this stuff, everything, not just the academic stuff, but all of it needs some spelling out. What did you actually do? So use bullet points for that. Keywords are the most important thing I'm going to say, though, today about this. Employers use digital tracking systems that prioritize keywords that are drawn from ads. So you have to repeat this keyword that was used in the ad in your CV and your cover letter to make it through the digital review, the online review. It's not viewed by a human for most jobs in the beginning. So you must show that you have mastered those keywords, or that you are using those keywords, that you are in the realm of what they're looking for. I do want to urge you not to be too put off by corporate language. This is hard. It is off-putting for us. Remember, though, that we're as off-putting to corporate people as they are to us. Remember that. Remember the language we take for granted, the kind of pretentious academies that we use, is as off-putting to industry people as vice versa. I hope that helps to relativize this for you. But some of these translations work. A presentation might be called a pitch. Teaching might be called leadership or training. Argumentation might be called influence. Writing would probably be called communications. Media might be called storytelling, and so on and so forth. Here's some other translations. Oh, by the way, do I have the, yes, this and the following are by Dr. Elizabeth Spies, who has given a talk called Beyond Academia. Very, very valuable talk. You can look her up for more information about her. But here are some of the words that we use and some of the words that are going to be used in a corporate setting. Here is what I meant by a word cloud on my earlier slide, where I said you need to draw the major words out of the ad, those are the keywords, and then mobilize them in your documents to make it through the digital review. This is a word cloud. You can use wordle.net and it will pull it up, and it's really easy. It's very visual. Okay, well, clearly development is the word that I need to attend to in this particular ad. And then there's project, and there's experience, and collaborate is a kind of a big one. And so you know that you're going to want to prioritize some of these words. You do have to translate your identity as well, the story you tell of who you are. And this is also from Dr. Elizabeth Spies, and I love this. Here's random Mark Smith. I don't know if Mark Smith is a real person, honestly. But anyway, here he is, and he has a sociology PhD from UCLA, and this is the bio on the left side. He is this, he is that, he got this degree, he got that, he's an adjunct faculty member, distinguished visiting scholar, and so on. Now look at how he could rewrite this. Whoops, I'm so sorry. I had to move my dashboard box away to be able to see the thing, but now I still can't really see it. It's still covered halfway by my dashboard, but I'm afraid to click again. So anyway, you can see this rewriting. He's a sociologist specializing in blah, blah, blah. He founded, led the development, he leads connected, something that I can't read, and lives and works in Silicon Valley. He's co-founder of the Social Media Research Foundation, and the net pay of this Mark Smith is $150,000 a year. So I have a direct experience with this, because when people apply to Professor Azin to work as post-academic coaches, and I do hire every so often a new coach as the demand increases, some of them give me letters that tell a story like the one on the left. And I don't want that story. I appreciate it. I recognize it for what it is. I'm like, you go, you academic, but I'm not an academic hiring committee. I am looking for a post-academic coach who's going to work for my company. I am looking for something somewhat more like the biography on the right. Not everybody knows how to do that. Okay, so the cover letter, where you narrate that story, the principle, it will follow the principles of business letter writing, and those are that it is one page, it is single spaced. It starts with the date at the top left, April 4th, 2000 whatever, 19, 2020. The address, name and address of the recipient goes under that. And there's a double space between the date and that address, and there's a double space between the address and the greeting, dear Ms. Stone or whomever. And then you go into the body paragraphs. And the first one is you introducing yourself. I'm writing to apply for the position as advertised, blah, blah. And then you make a connection, why you're interested in the job and the specific skills in your background that apply to the job, and then any weakness or any oddness needs a couple sentences, not a lot, not defensive and apologetic, but just a couple of sentences like, and one of them might be, why is a PhD applying for this job? And you will have to say that. So brainstorming, why are you interested? Have you interned or had interactions with this type of work or this company in the past? What is interesting? What is unique about you that this employer will find valuable? And then if there are gaps, what are they? And why are you changing careers? That's really the main thing that you want to talk about. Please don't use the word overqualified ever, even in your own thinking to yourself. And then the final paragraph, I look forward to an opportunity to discuss with you further, and I can be reached below. All right, so I told you there were challenges, and here is what they are. These are the bad stereotypes of PhDs. There is an idea that we don't have the best reputation or work well with others, that we are poor communicators, that we are wonks and eggheads who can't do any normal practical problem solving, and that we're prima donnas and lone wolves and we don't work well with others. So you have to be sure and be alert to those and ease those concerns in your materials. Like I said, the job search is multi-directional, and one of my postdoc coaches, Karen Cardozo, has a line in one of her excellent blog posts that says the academic system is narrow-minded and has no stake in developing you as a person of broader capacities. Only you are the CEO of that corporation. Okay, I'm going to wrap up by moving just very quickly through the rest of the slides, and if you see something that you want to ask about, please do ask about it. You do need to know that 70–80% of non-academic jobs are never advertised, so this is based on networking. The networking will come from that in-person building that I was mentioning, the person on the flight, the person you meet, your neighbors, your friends, connections of connections. Digital networking by using LinkedIn, which yes, you must use LinkedIn, and I urge you to use Twitter as well, and the informational interview. I'm not going to go through this, just to remind you that you can do an informational interview. You should have a good, solid, up-to-date page on LinkedIn and really mobilize that resource because it's a good one, and then do in-person networking, including going to events in your community or national or internationally to the extent that you can. And when you meet people, follow up, remember them, and communicate with them afterwards. I told you before that there's all these jobs. Frankly, there aren't that many jobs. The economy's in the tank, and it has been forever. So that's a whole separate story. But I want you not to forget that you can create your own career. You can. Some of you absolutely can. So please think about how you might do that. Can you monetize skills that you have? I wanted to tell my own story a little bit, but I don't have time. But I will just mention, because of this odd slide that might surprise you, that my very first business was a jewelry business. It was not coaching and consulting for the academic job market. And I started this business based on jewelry making, paper crafting, Japanese paper crafting skills that I had gained in the 1980s when I first went to live in Japan. And I did not know how any of this was going to turn out. And I just did the jewelry business because it was a low barrier to entry. And it was fun. And it didn't make very much money, but it taught me how to do all these skills. Website, PayPal, marketing, thinking like an entrepreneur. And when I began to think about something bigger, and I thought of the professor as in, I had all the skills necessary to do it. So please don't allow your fear, as Josh Bolt says, he's someone who's written prolifically on the non-academic transition, to stop you. Academics are highly risk adverse and highly depend on an external validation, but you can chart your own path. You really can. Your skills do have value. You have them. People will appreciate them. This quote tells one example of that. And you are the CEO of your particular corporation, of developing your career away from the narrow and rigid expectations of academia. So on that note, thank you very much for listening, and I will be happy to take some questions. Oops, didn't mean to do that.
All right, thank you so much, Karen. That was a really wonderful and helpful presentation. So we'll now open up the webinar for questions, and I'd like to start with a few submissions that came through the questions box during the presentation.
Okay.
So the first question that we have here is, Imagine Ph.D. says it's a planning tool for the humanities and social sciences.
Oh,
does that mean, yeah, does that mean that it doesn't work with biologists? If not, is there a similar interactive experience for STEM fields?
Okay, I would never say that it wouldn't work, because for all the reasons that I just talked about today, I think many of the challenges are the same. Some of the logistics are a little bit different in terms of taking STEM expertise versus humanities expertise, but I think that the mental and the psychological challenges and the time management challenges are identical. So I would never say you couldn't use it. But I'm sorry I forgot that. As soon as you said that, I remembered that that's why they created it, because they felt that humanities people had far fewer options than STEM people do for thinking about non-academic options. I can't think of an example off the top of my head of an interactive tool specifically for STEM people, but I think there is one. And the reason I think there is one is because I think that was why Imagine Ph.D. why the consortium created Imagine, is because they said, oh, STEM people have X and we want humanities people to have Y. So I'm going to have to get back to you on that, do a little research and see if I can find it. So I will tell Mary, and then she can pass it on to everybody.
Okay, great. How do you find internship opportunities? I've had a hard time finding opportunities, and most of the ones I've found so far seem to be only for undergraduates.
Yeah, so I think that's actually really common. I mean, internship is a word that is absolutely vastly more common for undergraduates. So it may be that that internships are less available than just your generic volunteer opportunities. So I wouldn't get hung up on the name. I mean, obviously it's more fun. It's quite a bit more gratifying to have the line on your CV that says, I'm an intern, rather than I'm a volunteer. But it may be that limiting your search to what's actually officially labeled as internship is too narrow a search, given the way that they are absolutely prioritize undergraduates. So just look for any kind of unpaid or volunteer opportunities that arise for you. Also, by the way, if you see an internship that looks really great for you, but it says this is only for undergraduates, please be entrepreneurial and get in touch with them. I hope you're doing that, because it's so valuable. There are so many things that come in. Again, this is all because of the way that this is all another way of putting that improvisational, unpredictable nature of the non-academic job search, because it's not what's advertised leads to what happens, which is more or less how the academic job search goes. It's really like, well, they seem to be in a lab that's doing this, and they're offering internships for undergrads. Well, if they're offering internships for undergrads, maybe they have space for me. So I'm going to write to them, and I'm going to write a really good letter or / email. And it's not just going to be like, hey, I'm just trying to do this, and do you think I can work there? That's not making a pitch for yourself. You have to make sure that every pitch you make is a finely crafted one that is really making you look like someone who's going to bring valuable expertise to them. And the fact that you're being willing in a very temporary, time-limited way, in a way that does not harm you in any way, financially or otherwise, that you're willing to do it either for free or for a very, very small amount of money, they might jump at that chance. So that's, again, I've sort of pivoted in terms of your question away from saying, oh, look for them here, and saying this is a space for entrepreneurship to try to create ones that may not actually exist already.
All right, so here's another submitted question. Can I leave the academy for a couple of years and come back?
Yes. I mean, not yes, I hear the question. That's not my answer. Sorry. My answer to that is it's not great. It's not optimal. I will never say it's impossible, because I've learned that things I thought were impossible. Sometimes I have thought things were impossible that turned out people pulled it off. But it's really hard and very rare, and the academy is really rigid. I mean, basically the academy is as rigid as industry is. They each want to see, it's kind of like narcissism. It's ego. They want to see people who are like them, who think like them, and who don't threaten them. And who confirm their biases. This is very cynical, but I really, really think that overall it's true. And of course, as some of you are thinking, oh, I know an exception. Well, of course you know an exception. There are always exceptions. There are exceptions, but I want to give advice, and I said this last week as well, that is as useful as it can be to the widest number of people, and to prevent as much harm as I possibly can, because people are harmed by the academic job market. And so I try to give advice that empowers you to avoid that harm. And so, so in general, hiring committees like to see their own biases confirmed. And so just like Karen Kaplan said, that industry search committees don't love to see people who've done postdocs. Academic search committees don't love to see people who've done industry, because frankly, each side, they question your loyalties. And they're like, well, we know that you can make twice this salary out in industry. Why in the world are you looking for this academic job? And once you get here, you're not going to stay. And then industry thinks the same thing. They think you just want that intellectual freedom of a university job and to be a teacher, and you don't really want what we do here in the industry, and you're going to leave. And nobody wants to hire someone who's going to leave. So that is what this may have been a more elaborated answer than you really wanted, but I wanted to really get at the principles that I'm working from when I give the advice that I do. So I will never say it's impossible, but it's quite difficult.
Okay, thanks. So another question that's come through is, are there any possible suggestions that you could offer for nonprofit jobs in agriculture? And I hope I'm interpreting this question that was submitted correctly, but I think it's saying that their skill set doesn't necessarily tend to match what is advertised in the job description.
Mm-hmm. So I can't answer about something that's specific when you're getting into topical content, I'm not qualified. I mean, and again, in the principle of first do no harm, the Hippocratic career Hippocratic oath. I definitely don't want to give advice that I'm not thoroughly, don't have any expertise in. But your question I did perk up my ears at the last part of it, where you said, the questioner said, my skills don't exactly match. And that's a line that I hear all the time, and I hear it from my academic job market clients as well as post-academic clients. And when I hear that, I rarely believe it, because that line right there is the nexus point of that slide that I showed you back in the beginning, the one by Margie Thomas with the little picture of the comic from PhD Comics about why do academics think they have no skills. And if you go back to that slide and you look at all those things, the basic message that academics get through grad school and postdocs is you don't know, you're not good enough, this isn't right. And we get too used to that thinking. It becomes a default, and it plays into it's not the same thing as imposter syndrome, but it sure does play into it. They're almost flip sides of the same coin. And so I get really skeptical when I hear a PhD say to me, my skills don't match this. I don't do exactly what they do. Well, maybe it's not exactly, but it is damn close. And furthermore, you do a bunch of other really fantastic stuff, and you are just forgetting that you do it, and you are not allowing yourself to know it, and not allowing yourself to say it, and to say it effectively. So I can't speak to the specifics. I don't know them, don't know your background, don't know this job in agriculture, but I would hazard to guess that your skills are quite a bit closer than you are giving yourself credit for, and I want to urge you to look at it again with from that perspective. And you may need someone to help you. That's the other thing. Trying to remember if I said this last week, but I don't think I did. You are in some ways you aren't the best authority on your own skills, and that's because you underestimate them too much. That's very common in academia, especially for women, first generation, and scholars of color too, that you might underestimate what you have accomplished and what you can bring and what you do, both because of imposter syndrome and also because people have accused you of being imposter for so many years. So you may need an advisor who can, almost a coach really, who can help you to identify in your own record what you're actually good at. That is actually what my post-academic coaches do, and not just the ones who work for me. I think the ones who, there are others I think out in the world. And you might find that useful and actually quite necessary. So I'd urge you to consider that as well. All right, that was a long answer.
Could you elaborate on what you look for in a good non-tenure track academic job, such as a full-time instructor position at a community college?
Will you repeat that?
Sure, no problem. Could you elaborate on what to look for in a good non-tenure track academic job, such as a full-time instructor position at a community college?
Okay, I thought that's what you said, and so that's not actually the topic of today's webinar, though, because that is still an academic job application. That's not a non-academic job. Just because it's NTT at a community college doesn't make it non-academic. The same principles will apply that I talked about last week. You will construct a record like I talked about last week in terms of your teaching and how you describe your teaching, and replacing, the inevitable temptation to be highly emotionalized about how passionate you are and how much you love students, the need to replace that with concrete specifics and evidence and argumentation about your record and all of those things. But that's not a non-academic job application. So I think it's interesting that you asked that. And I think it's interesting because I think it could, I'm not taking issue with this questioner per se individually, but it could betray the idea that the community college NTT job is viewed as so beyond the pale that you are categorizing it as non-academic, but it's quite academic. And by the way, I do have words to say about the community college application, and I'm actually going to tell you, please Google Rob Jenkins. He is a writer. Well, he is a community college faculty member, a full professor, I believe, and in Georgia, I think. And he has written a long series of posts, probably 10 or 20 posts at this point, for the Chronicle of Higher Education on the community college job application and interview process. He is really the expert. He's fantastic. Please read what he has to say about that.
Okay, our next question kind of builds on an earlier question about leaving academia. They ask, what about the reverse? Can people get a professor job and then go to the industry afterward?
Well, I'll go back to what Karen Kaplan said, and the general. So I'll start with what she said, and then I will pivot to, what I and my post-academic coaches have observed, that industry likes to see loyalty to industry, and so they're not going to be thrilled with a faculty. They're not going to be falling all over each other trying to grab the tenure track, professor who's now applying for one of their jobs. They're going to have to be persuaded that you're serious and that your skill set does match what they want, because these are different skill sets. In academia, it's sort of pure research and it's teaching and it's service. And industry, while those are absolutely 100% translatable, as I spent the entire last hour telling you, you do have to be able to articulate them differently so that the search committee, they're probably not, I wonder if they call them search committees. Anyway, let's call them hiring committees, industry hiring committees, so that they understand that those skills are translatable. So you have to do some work to make yourself legible. You have to, and that's what Karen, because they're going to have a bias that says that you aren't going to be loyal to industry priorities. That's Karen Kaplan's view. And then my view is PhDs, and especially PhDs who have been on the tenure track, who have fully been professors, don't have great reputations. For those 4 reasons that I mentioned. There's the idea that we are eggheads, that we're wonks, that we use incomprehensible language, that we're prima donnas, and that we're not team players, and so on. So and also that there's the idea, can you commit yourself to research in somebody else's, in the end, it is for profit. So remember that objective on my model resume that said I'm interested in increasing company profits by doing blah, blah, blah. Well, can you do that? Are you able to do that? The fundamental enterprise is you're increasing company profits by bringing your research skills into their labs. Well, they have to make sure that you're on board with that. So all of those are simply challenges. It's not impossible. I will never say that it's impossible. I simply want to arm you, forearm you with all of the challenges that you would have to overcome in your application documents and in your interview to make sure they feel that you are, in fact, someone well suited to their job.
Okay, our next question is, how do you figure out how much to ask either for a consulting task or as a job offer?
Oh my. Oh my goodness, that's a great question. Those are two very different calculations. Okay, so let's take consulting. You have to figure out, first of all, what your own hourly rate will be. And that's going to take some doing. And it's going to take some research. You're going to have to investigate in your field and the related fields of consulting what people are charging, and try to calibrate yourself so that you are expecting the right hourly rate for who and what you are, for the norms of your field, and for the level of expertise that you have. You are probably, the temptation will be to set that rate too low, most likely. Most likely. There will be exceptions, but by and large, people who come out of the world that we're all inhabiting undervalue ourselves, and especially if you're a woman. And so the trick is going to be that you have a sense of what your hourly rate really should be. Now, having established that, you then have to figure out the number of hours you're going to spend on that task. And what you must not forget is that you may also have equipment that you have to use to execute the task. And you also have to have research and preparation time. And then perhaps there might be writing up time or phone call time, internet research, communication time. Every bit of that has to be accounted for. So by the time you account for all of that, the sum total is going to be higher, most likely, than you expected. And that, I want to urge you to go with that total. When you look at it, you're like, oh my goodness, that's like, many $1,000s. Yeah, that's what your time is actually worth. And see, what people forget, and this is very much a function of the academy, is that when you get hired as an adjunct, they pay you for your teaching time in the classroom, and they're not paying you for the hours and hours and hours of prep that you had to do, the reading you had to do, the figure out which text to use, create the syllabus, write the syllabus, or revise the syllabus, all of it, go to the library, get the books on hold, all of this stuff. It's completely uncompensated, and that's part of what makes academia so exploitative. When you reinvent yourself to be a consultant, you cannot afford to forget any of that work. You need to get compensated for all of that work. And what the tendency will be is you will forget. And I'm not saying you'll make mistakes. Everybody does. Everybody does. And most people absolutely undercharge in the beginning. But so I just want to empower you. Those are things that you want to do. Have a really competitive hourly rate, and account for all the hours that you will actually be spending on the task. Down to the really micro things. And remember, think about attorneys, right? They're every quarter hour, the billable hours, right? Think like an attorney, a billable hour, and remember that they charge every quarter hour, every 15 minutes, the clock, is going up. So be that specific. Now, in terms of the ask, that's really hard. So first of all, most jobs don't actually ask you for your preferred salary. I know we do hear of those, and they do happen, but it's not that common. And honestly, they don't really usually base their salary offer on what you said, because even in corporate jobs, just like academic jobs, they have a salary that they're expecting to pay the person, and the range is going to be very small. It's the difference between, 75,000 and 80,000. So like you might say 80 and they were planning to give 75, and maybe because you said 80, they're going to, okay, we'll offer 76. I mean, it's not going to be a massive difference either way. So all I want you to do, again, is use your research skills. really use, and here is where you could look at monster.com and idealist.org, and you can review, you can look at similar jobs where the salary range is posted, and you can calibrate it for the fact that you're bringing in advanced education and a certain amount of experience, but maybe you actually have less experience than some other people who didn't spend all the time in grad school and postdocs, whatever. So, you know, calibrate it, and then ask, I would say ask the higher end of that, because again, we undervalue ourselves as PhDs. That's what we do. That's our default. So please don't think that by asking less, you are more likely to get the job, because you aren't. That's not how it works. And you know what's interesting? I'm just going to share this because I think it's pertinent. When I was running my jewelry business, I had to figure out how to set prices for my jewelry. It was really hard. It was so uncomfortable. And I did a lot of research about it. I read a lot of there's a lot of writing out there about pricing. How do you price your artwork and so on? And the common knowledge is that people undervalue it. And sorry, that's not my main point. My main point is when you increase your prices, you don't necessarily decrease demand. Sometimes you increase your prices and you increase demand, because by virtue of the increased price, you have made it appear to be a higher value object that people want more. Whereas by decreasing your prices, you've made it look like a cheap thing that people don't really want. So same with your own salary ask. By undervaluing it, you may be giving a message about yourself that you're just not worth very much. And so please resist that temptation. That's probably a good point for us to stop on, since we're out of time, and it's a good value yourself is really the principle that I want to leave you with.
That's wonderful. Yeah, as you mentioned, unfortunately, we are out of time, and we'll end the webinar there. Karen, I want to thank you again for a wonderful presentation, and I'd like to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, all of ESA's webinars are archived on our website, www.entsoc.org, and this webinar will be live there shortly. So thanks again, and we'll close it out there.